The morning air at Ramal House was still. Too still. Kind of silence that comes just before everything changes forever. Camilla stood by the window of her private drawing room, cup of tea cooling in her hand. She watched the mist roll. Across the Wiltshire countryside, unaware that 12 miles away, a convoy of black vehicles was already moving toward her estate. Inside those vehicles sat men and women who did not smile. They wore the insignia of the Royal Guard, but their faces carried something else. Determination. Maybe anger. They had orders that came from the highest level of the crown, orders that would shock the nation within hours. But before we go further into this story, if you love real drama that sounds too wild to be true, hit that subscribe button. You won't believe where this goes. The call had come to Camilla's private secretary at dawn. Brief formal message. The royal household required immediate access to certain items at Ramal House. No explanation, no warning. Just a time. 9 o'clock. That gave them less than 2 hours. Camilla's face went pale when she heard. She set down her tea with a hand that trembled just slightly. She knew exactly what they were coming for. The jewels. Not just any jewels. These were pieces that once belonged to Elizabeth, the late queen. Diamonds that had rested on the monarch's neck at state dinners. Emeralds that caught the light during Jubilee celebrations. Pearls that carried decades of history in every smooth, lustrous surface. How those jewels came to be at Ramal's house was a question. Many had asked, but few dared to answer publicly. Some said they were gifts. Others whispered darker theories. Loans that were never returned. Items that should have gone back to the royal collection after Elizabeth's death, but somehow remained in Camilla's possession. Now someone wanted them back. The staff at Ramal House moved quickly, but nervously. Word spread through the estate like wildfire. The maids exchanged glances in the hallways. The groundskeeper stopped mid-task, pruning shears still in hand, staring at nothing. Everyone knew this was not normal. Royal visits happened, yes. But raids? Never. Camilla made a phone call. Her voice was measured, controlled, but those who knew her well could hear the edge underneath. She spoke to someone at Buckingham Palace. The conversation was brief. When she hung up, her expression had hardened. She walked upstairs to her private chambers, her footsteps echoing in the grand stairwell. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Inside a locked drawer of her dresser, wrapped in velvet cloth, lay some of the most valuable pieces of the collection. She touched the fabric but did not open it. For a moment she simply stood there, one hand on the drawer, the other pressed against her chest. What was she thinking in that moment? Regret? Defiance? Fear? Outside, the iron gates of the estate began to swing open. No one had pressed the button. The security system had been remotely overridden. The convoy rolled in. 3 black Range Rovers moved up the gravel driveway in perfect formation. They stopped in front of the main entrance, engines still running for a moment before cutting to silence. The doors opened in unison. 8 members of the Royal Guard stepped out, followed by 2 officials in suits. One of them carried a leather briefcase. The other held a document with a royal seal visible even from a distance. Camilla's butler, an older man who had served the family for 20 years, opened the front door. His face was professionally blank, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the door handle. The lead official did not waste time with pleasantries. "We are here under direct orders from His Majesty's office. We require access to the premises, and specifically 2 items documented in this inventory." He held up the paper. Even from where she stood at the top of the stairs, Camilla could see the list. It was long. Her heart sank. This was not a polite request. This was a seizure. The question burning in everyone's mind was simple but dangerous. Why now? What had changed? And more importantly, what did the royal family know that the public did not? Camilla descended the stairs slowly, her chin held high. Every eye in the entrance hall was on her. The air felt thick, electric with tension. She stopped 3 steps from the bottom and looked directly at the official. "I assume you have the proper authorization?" He nodded once and extended the document toward her. She did not take it. Instead, she spoke quietly but clearly. "Then let's get this over with." But what happened next would prove that nothing about this day would be simple. and the secrets hidden in those jewels were far more explosive than anyone imagined. The royal guard moved through Ramal's house like a surgical team. They knew exactly where to go. Someone had given them detailed information, floor plans, room layouts, even the locations of hidden safes that Camilla thought were private. She followed them through her own home, a silent witness to the dismantling of her world. Her face remained composed, but inside, a storm was building. How did they know so much? Who had betrayed her? The first stop was the master bedroom. 2 guards stood at the door while the officials entered with Camilla. They went straight to the dresser, to the locked drawer she had touched just minutes before. "The key, please," one official said. His voice was polite, but firm. Camilla reached into her pocket and produced a small silver key. Her hand was steady as she passed it over. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her shake. The drawer opened with a soft click. The official pulled back the velvet cloth, revealing what lay beneath. Even in the dim morning light filtering through the curtains, the jewels seemed to glow with their own inner fire. A diamond necklace that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth's personal collection. Not the crown jewels. No. These were more intimate. Pieces the late queen had chosen herself, worn at private family dinners and quiet moments away from the public eye. There was a bracelet, too. Emeralds set in platinum, each stone the size of a fingernail. Elizabeth had worn it on her 80th birthday. Photographs from that day showed the queen's hand resting on a table. The green gems catching the camera flash. Now they were here, in Camilla's home, in her locked drawer. The official carefully placed each item into a padded case he had brought. He worked with the precision of someone who knew the value of what he handled. One mistake, one scratch, and he would be answering to powers he did not want to face. Camilla watched in silence. She did not protest. She did not explain. She simply stood there, arms crossed, her jaw set in a hard line. But inside her mind, memories were flooding back. She remembered the day Elizabeth had shown her these pieces. It was years ago, before Charles was king, when relationships in the family were complicated but not yet completely fractured. Elizabeth had opened her personal jewelry box and gestured to the emerald bracelet. "This was a gift from Philip," the queen had said quietly. On our 25th anniversary, he had terrible taste in most things, but he got this right. There had been a small smile on Elizabeth's face, a rare moment of warmth. Had Camilla borrowed the bracelet that day, or had it been offered? The truth was murky even in her own memory. Borrowed items that became permanent. Gifts that were never formally recorded. Lines that blurred over decades until no one was quite sure where. Generosity ended and appropriation began. The officials moved to the next location, the library. This room was Camilla's sanctuary. Walls lined with books, a fireplace that crackled on cold evenings, and a small antique desk where she kept her most private correspondence. They went straight to the desk. "This is private," Camilla said, her first real protest of the morning. "You have no right to my personal papers." The lead official turned to her with an expression that was not unkind, but absolutely immovable. "We have every right, ma'am. The authorization covers any items related to the royal collection, including documentation of provenance and transfer." Provenance. That word hung in the air like a threat. They wanted proof of how she got the jewels. Records of gifts, letters of permission. Anything that would legitimize her possession of items worth millions. Camilla knew what they would find. Or rather, what they would not find. The official opened the desk drawer and began removing documents. He scanned each one quickly, professionally. Most he set aside, but 3 letters he placed into a separate folder. Camilla's breath caught. She knew which letters those were. Correspondence with Elizabeth's private secretary. Notes about borrowed items for an upcoming engagement. Vague language that could mean anything or nothing. Words that had seemed innocent at the time but now looked damning under scrutiny. Why had she kept them? She should have burned those letters years ago. But some foolish part of her had wanted proof that these pieces had come to her legitimately, even if the legitimacy was paper-thin. The search continued. Room by room, drawer by drawer. In the guest bedroom, they found a tiara wrapped in tissue paper, hidden in a hat box, at the back of a closet. Camilla's face went white when she saw them pull it out. She had forgotten about that one. It was not one of Elizabeth's major pieces. Just a small diamond tiara, something the Queen had worn in her younger years and then retired from use. But it was documented in the royal archives, recorded, catalogued, and it was here. The official's expression did not change. But he made a note on his clipboard. That note would end up in a report. The report would end up on someone's desk at Buckingham Palace. Decisions would be made. Camilla's butler appeared in the doorway, looking distressed. "Ma'am, there are reporters at the gate." Of course there were. News traveled fast in royal circles. Someone had tipped off the press. Within the hour, this story would be everywhere. Headlines would scream about stolen jewels and royal scandals. Social media would explode with theories and accusations. Camilla closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them again, her composure had returned. She had been through scandals before. She had survived public hatred, vicious tabloids, and years of being cast as the villain in someone else's love story. She would survive this too. But as she watched the officials carry case after case of jewels out of her home, she could not help but wonder, was this really about the jewels? Or was this about something much bigger? Someone wanted her humiliated. Someone wanted her power diminished. And someone had just succeeded in the first part of their plan. The question was, who? And what came next? By noon, the news had broken worldwide. Every major outlet carried the story. The headlines were brutal. Queen Consort's estate raided and jewel seizure. Royal family reclaims Elizabeth's treasures from Camilla. Palace orders. Unprecedented search of Camilla's private home. The footage was even worse. Cameras positioned outside the gates had caught the royal guard vehicles leaving the estate. Through the tinted windows, viewers could just make out the shapes of cases being transported. The internet did the rest, zooming in, enhancing, speculating. Inside Ramel House, Camilla sat alone in her drawing room. The same room where this had all begun, just hours earlier. Her tea was cold. She had not touched it. Her phone buzzed constantly. Messages from friends, from advisors, from family members. She ignored them all. What could she possibly say? How could she explain what she herself did not fully understand? But one call she could not ignore came at 12:15. A private number. She knew who it was before she answered. Charles. His voice on the other end was strained. Tired. He had aged a decade in the year. Since becoming king, the crown sat heavy on him. And everyone could see it. "Camilla, I need you to understand. This was not my decision." She said nothing. Let him fill the silence. The Privy Council raised concerns. Questions about the provenance of certain items. There was pressure from Parliament members, from the media. I had no choice but to authorize an inventory. An inventory? She repeated flatly. Is that what we're calling a raid now? It was not meant to be public. Someone leaked it. Of course someone did. That was how the game was played. Leak to the press? Let public opinion form. And then act as though you were simply responding to concerns. Charles continued, his voice dropping lower. There are people who want to see us divided. People who have never accepted you as Queen Consort. They are using this to drive a wedge between us. Then don't let them, Camilla said quietly. Stand with me, publicly, make a statement that this was a misunderstanding. There was a long pause. Too long. I cannot do that right now. The optics are too complicated. We need to let the investigation conclude. Once we have clarity on the provenance of each item, then we can address it. Clarity on the provenance. He was asking her to prove her innocence. To provide documentation she did not have. To justify possession of items that had drifted into her hands through a fog of decades and complicated relationships. Her voice was ice. Camilla, she ended the call. She sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in her hand. Then, with deliberate calm, she set it down on the table and walked to the window. Outside, the reporters had multiplied. There were at least 20 now, crowded against the gate with cameras and microphones. They were hungry for a statement, for a glimpse of her face. For any scrap of drama they could feed to the public, she would not give them that satisfaction. but someone else was watching the news with very different emotions. Someone who had set this entire chain of events into motion. Princess Anne stood in her study at Gatcombe Park, arms crossed, watching the television coverage with grim satisfaction. She had never liked Camilla, never trusted her, and she had loved her mother with a fierce, protective devotion that death had not diminished. When Anne had begun quietly investigating the whereabouts of her mother's jewelry after the funeral, she had been shocked by what she discovered. Items missing from the official inventory, pieces that should have been returned to the royal collection but were nowhere to be found. It had taken months of careful work, discreet conversations with Elizabeth's former staff, reviews of old photographs and records. Slowly, a pattern had emerged. Many of those missing pieces had last been seen in Camilla's possession. Anne had taken her findings to the Privy Council. She had presented documentation, photographs, witness statements. She had made an airtight case that this was not about personal vendetta, but about protecting the heritage of the crown. The council had agreed. The king had been forced to act, regardless of his personal feelings. Anne felt no guilt. She was doing what her mother could no longer do, protecting what was rightfully the crown's, making sure that history and legacy were not quietly stolen away by someone who had no rightful claim to them. But as she watched the news coverage, another thought crept in. Was this enough? Or was this just the beginning? Back at Rommel House, Camilla's private secretary entered the drawing room. She was a young woman, efficient and loyal, but even she looked shaken. "Ma'am, you need to see this." She held out a tablet showing social media. The posts were everywhere. Most were vicious. Accusations of theft, calls for Camilla to be stripped of her title, comparisons to historical scandals and disgraced royals. But it was not just random people online. Public figures were weighing in. A prominent historian had given an interview, calling the situation deeply troubling. A member of parliament had made a statement, questioning whether someone under investigation should be representing the crown. The tide was turning, and it was turning fast. Camilla handed the tablet back without comment. She had been hated before. She had survived worse. But this felt different. This felt coordinated, calculated. Someone was not just trying to embarrass her. Someone was trying to remove her. That evening, a second convoy arrived at Rommel House, but this one was not from the Royal Guard. 2 black cars pulled up, and out stepped a man in his 60s with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit. His name was Edmund Harrow, and he was the best crisis management attorney in London. He had represented presidents, billionaires, more than a few royals over the years. Camilla had called him that afternoon. If this was war, she needed a general. Harrow was shown to the library where Camilla waited. She did not stand when he entered. She simply gestured to the chair across from her. "How bad is it?" she asked directly. Harrow set down his briefcase and looked at her with the frank assessment of someone who dealt in truth. "Not comfort. It's bad, but not impossible. We need to control the narrative immediately. I need you to authorize me to access any documentation you have regarding these items. Letters, photographs, anything that shows these were gifts or authorized loans."
And if such documentation is
limited, his expression did not change. "Then we build a different defense. We focus on the length of possession, on the ambiguity of royal gift-giving customs, on precedent. But I will be honest with you, ma'am. If we cannot prove legitimate transfer, this becomes a question of the king's mercy, which I may not have," Camilla said quietly. Harrow did not disagree. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. "Tell me everything. From the beginning, every piece they took, and how it came into your possession. Leave nothing out. I cannot help you if I am surprised." Camilla took a deep breath. This would be a long night. Outside, the reporters settled in for a vigil. Inside, secrets long buried were about to be unearthed. And somewhere in London, in a royal residence, decisions were being made that would change everything. 3 days passed. 3 days of silence from Buckingham Palace. 3 days of media frenzy. 3 days of Camilla trapped in her estate Per prisoner of public opinion, the royal guard had catalogued 37 pieces in total. 37 items that should have been in the royal collection but were found at Ramel House. The official inventory had been leaked, of course. Everything was leaked now. The public pored over every entry. A diamond brooch, a string of pearls, earrings that Elizabeth had worn to Prince William's wedding. Each item became evidence in the court of public opinion. The verdict was damning. But it was one particular piece that caused the most outrage. A necklace known as the Lover's Eye Pendant. It was a delicate piece, not especially valuable in monetary terms, but its history was priceless. The pendant contained a miniature portrait of a young Queen Elizabeth's eye, commissioned by Philip in the early years of their marriage. It was intensely personal, intimate, the kind of thing that should never have left the family. Yet there it was, found in Camilla's jewelry box, wrapped in silk. The tabloids went wild. How could she? Screamed one headline above a photo of Elizabeth wearing the pendant. Another showed a side-by-side comparison. Elizabeth at a state dinner in the necklace, and Camilla at a private event wearing what appeared to be the same piece. The evidence was circumstantial but damaging. Social media detectives pulled up dozens of photos, claiming to identify Elizabeth's jewelry on Camilla at various events over the years. Some claims were accurate. Others were reaches. It did not matter. The narrative had solidified. Camilla the thief. Camilla the opportunist who had stolen from a dead queen. Inside Ramel House, Edmund Harrow worked around the clock. He interviewed staff members. He reviewed decades of correspondence. He built timelines and documented every interaction Camilla had ever had regarding royal jewelry. What he found was not good. Most of the pieces had no clear documentation of transfer. No formal letters of gift. No signed records. Just verbal understandings, casual loans that became permanent, and the murky customs of royal life where boundaries were often unclear. This is what happens when families operate on trust rather than contracts. Harrow muttered, flipping through another stack of papers. Everyone assumes. No one documents. And decades later, we are left with this mess. Camilla sat across from him, exhausted. She had barely slept. When she did, she dreamed of Elizabeth. Sometimes they were arguing. Sometimes the late queen simply stared at her with sad, disappointed eyes. There was one letter, Camilla said suddenly, from Elizabeth. I had forgotten about it until now. Harrow looked up sharply. What kind of letter? Personal correspondence. From about 15 years ago. She mentioned lending me several pieces for an upcoming engagement. I think she specified which ones. Where is this letter? In storage? At my London residence. Harrow was already pulling out his phone. I am sending someone there now. If that letter exists and it names specific items, it could change everything. But even as he spoke, he knew it might not be enough. A letter about lending was not the same as a letter of permanent gift. In 15 years was a long time for a loan to go unread. Meanwhile, at Clarence House, King Charles faced a different kind of storm. His advisors were divided. Some urged him to stand by his wife publicly. Others warned that doing so would damage the monarchy's credibility when public anger was so high. The institution is more important than any individual, one advisor said bluntly. That includes the queen consort. Charles looked at the man with barely concealed anger. She is my wife, and you are the king. The monarchy has survived scandals before by showing that it values duty over personal loyalty. That is what the people need to see now. Charles stood and walked to the window. Outside, London moved on with its daily life. People going to work, tourists taking photographs, the world turning. But inside the palace walls, everything felt frozen. Stuck in this moment of crisis, he thought about his mother. What would she do? Elizabeth had always chosen duty. Always. Even when it cost her personal happiness. Even when it meant sacrifices that haunted her. But Elizabeth had never faced a choice between the crown and her spouse. Philip had been controversial, yes, but never accused of theft. Never accused of stealing from the monarchy itself. I need more time, Charles said finally. Before any statements are made, I want to see the full investigative report. Every piece of evidence. Every document. His advisors exchanged glances. Time was not their friend. Every day of silence looked like complicity. But Charles was king, and for now, his word was final. The breakthrough came on the fourth day. Harrow's team found the letter. It was in a box of old correspondence at Camilla's London residence, exactly where she said it would be. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting unmistakably Elizabeth's. "My dear Camilla," it began. "Following our conversation, I am pleased to lend you the following pieces for the upcoming state visit. ... The letter listed 8 items. 8 specific pieces of jewelry described in detail. Harrow read it 3 times, checking every word against the inventory of seized items. 6 of the 8 pieces mentioned in the letter were on that list. "This is good," he said, though his tone was cautious. "This establishes that at least some items were in your possession with the Queen's knowledge and consent." "But it says lend," Camilla pointed out. "Not give." "Yes, which means technically you should have returned them. But here's the argument we make. The letter is 15 years old. The Queen never asked for them back. You continued to possess them openly, attending public events. If she had wanted them returned, she would have said so. Her silence constituted implied consent for continued possession. It was thin, but it was something. Harrow prepared a formal response to be submitted to the royal household. He included copies of the letter, testimony from staff members who recalled Elizabeth discussing the jewelry with Camilla, and a legal argument about the ambiguities of royal gift-giving customs. It was the best defense they could mount. Whether it would be enough was another question entirely. That night, Camilla did something she had not done in days. She called her children from her first marriage. They had stayed in the background during the scandal, unsure how to help. "Ma'am, are you all right?" her son asked, his voice tight with worry. "I will be," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "This will pass. These things always do." But even as she said the words, she wondered if they were true. Some scandals did not pass. Some left permanent scars. Some ended careers and destroyed reputations beyond repair. She thought about Diana, about how the public had canonized her after death, turning her into a saint while casting Camilla as the eternal villain. For years, she had been booed in public, hated by millions who had never met her. She had survived that. She had rebuilt her reputation slowly, through years of quiet service and dedication. She had finally earned a measure of respect, and now this. This threatened to undo it all, to reduce her once again to a caricature. The woman who stole the prince and now apparently stole from the Queen. The phone call ended. Her children promised to visit soon. She thanked them and hung up. Alone in the dark of her bedroom, Camilla allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. One moment where she did not have to be strong, composed, regal. She cried, not for the jewels, not for the scandal. She cried for what this meant, for the message it sent, that she was still, after everything, an outsider, someone whose possession of royal treasures would always be questioned, someone whose place in the family was conditional, temporary, subject to revocation. Tomorrow, she would be strong again. Tomorrow, she would fight. But tonight, she grieved. The royal household's response arrived by courier on the 6th day, a heavy envelope with the official seal. Edmund Harrow opened it in Camilla's presence, his face carefully neutral as he read. The letter was formal, legal, and devastating. Following a thorough review of the documentation provided and the inventory of items seized, the royal household has determined that the majority of items in question were obtained without proper authorization or documentation of permanent transfer. Harrow continued reading aloud, his voice steady despite the content. While the letter from Her late Majesty does establish temporary loan of certain pieces, the failure to return said items after a period exceeding 14 years constitutes improper retention of crown property. Camilla felt something cold settle in her chest. This was not just a reprimand. This was a legal finding. However, Harrow continued, and his tone shifted slightly. In recognition of the complex nature of royal customs regarding personal property, And in consideration of the Queen Consort's service to the Crown, His Majesty has elected to treat this matter as a civil rather than criminal issue. Civil rather than criminal. That was something, at least. They were not going to prosecute her, but the stain would remain. The letter concluded with terms. All seized items would remain in Crown possession. Camilla would sign a formal acknowledgement that the items were improperly retained. In exchange, no further legal action would be pursued, and the matter would be considered closed. They are giving you a way out, Harrow said carefully, but it requires you to admit fault, to accept that you should not have had those pieces. And if I refuse, Harrow set down the letter and looked at her directly. Then this goes to court. It becomes public. Every detail gets examined under oath. The media circus we have seen so far would be nothing compared to what a trial would bring. And ma'am, I must be honest with you. Our chances of winning are not good. Camilla stood and walked to the window. It was raining. The reporters outside had thinned but not disappeared. Few dedicated ones remained, standing under umbrellas, waiting for something to happen. She thought about her choices. Sign the admission and move forward. Accept the humiliation, but end the crisis. Or fight. Drag it out. Risk complete destruction for a slim chance at vindication. Pride wanted to fight, but wisdom counseled surrender. I will sign, she said quietly. But I want something in return. What? I want a private meeting with Charles, face to face. Before any of this becomes public, Harrow nodded. I'll make the request. The meeting was arranged for the following evening at Windsor Castle. Private. No staff except the minimum security required. Charles agreed immediately when the request came through official channels. Perhaps he wanted this to end as much as she did. Or perhaps he felt guilty. Either way, he would see her. Camilla drove to Windsor herself. No driver, no security detail beyond what was mandatory. She wanted these final moments of autonomy for whatever came next. The castle was quiet as she was escorted through familiar hallways to a small private sitting room. Charles was already there, standing by the fireplace. He looked older. The lines around his eyes had deepened. They stared at each other for a long moment. You look tired, he said finally. I am tired. He gestured to the chairs by the fire. They sat down, the flames casting moving shadows across their faces. Camilla, I want you to know that I did everything I could to prevent this from becoming public. But not everything you could to prevent it from happening. He flinched. The evidence was compelling. The Privy Council, Parliament, even my own advisors all said action had to be taken, and you could not say no. I am king. I do not have the luxury of personal feelings overriding institutional necessity. There it was, the truth they both knew but had not spoken. The crown was bigger than both of them. Always had been. Always would be. Camilla leaned forward. When your mother lent me those pieces, it was not just about the jewelry. It was about acceptance. About her signaling to the world that I was part of the family. I belonged. Charles's expression softened slightly. I know. And now, by taking them back, by forcing me to admit I should not have had them, what signal does that send? He had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer, but could not bring himself to say it. The signal was clear. Camilla's place was still conditional. Still dependent on royal favor, still subject to revocation. I will sign your document, she said. I will admit fault. I will do whatever is necessary to end this. But I need to know, Charles. Do you still want me beside you? Or have I become too much of a liability? His face crumpled. For a moment, the king disappeared, and only the man remained. Tired, conflicted, weighed down by impossible choices. Of course I want you beside me. You are my wife. I love you. But I am also king, and if I have to choose between you and the stability of the crown... He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Camilla nodded slowly. She understood. She had always understood. She had married into this world with open eyes, knowing what it would cost. Then we do what we must, she said. We sign the papers. We make the statements. We move forward. Together, Charles asked, and there was real vulnerability in his voice. For now, Camilla said, But Charles, things have changed. You know that. We both know that. The meeting ended with no embrace. No reassurances. Just a quiet understanding that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Camilla signed the acknowledgement the next day. The document was brief and formal. She acknowledged improper retention of crown property and agreed that all seized items rightfully belonged to the royal collection. The statement released to the press was carefully worded. The matter has been resolved amicably. The Queen Consort recognizes that certain items should have been returned to the Crown Estate. All parties consider this matter closed. No admission of theft. No criminal wrongdoing. It's just a quiet closing of a scandalous chapter. The media coverage was predictably divided. Some outlets called it a cover-up. Others praised the royal family's discretion. The public remained skeptical, but gradually moved on to the next scandal, the next outrage. But within royal circles, everyone understood what had really happened. Camilla had been put in her place, reminded that her position was a gift that could be revoked, shown that even as Queen Consort, she was not untouchable. Princess Anne watched the news coverage with satisfaction. Justice, in her view, had been served. Her mother's property had been returned where it belonged. The message had been sent, but Anne also noticed something else. The distance that had opened between Charles and Camilla. The careful way they now appeared in public, standing just slightly further apart than before. Some wounds and thought never fully heal, and she wondered, not for the first time, if this scandal had been about more than jewelry, if it had been about power, succession, the future of the monarchy itself. Only time would tell what consequences this crisis would bring. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be quite the same again. 6 months later, the world had moved on. New scandals occupied the tabloids. New crises demanded attention. The jewel seizure had become a footnote, occasionally referenced, but no longer headline news. But for those directly involved, nothing had really ended. The wounds were still fresh beneath carefully maintained surfaces. Camilla resumed her royal duties. She attended charity events, visited hospitals, performed the duties of Queen Consort with professional efficiency, but those who knew her well could see the difference. Something vital had been extinguished. The warmth that had gradually developed over years of public service had cooled into careful formality. She and Charles appeared together at state functions. They smiled for photographers. They played their roles. But the private moments that had once sustained them were fewer now. Rarer, strained in bed at night. They lay side by side but miles apart. The distance was not physical, but emotional. A chasm had opened that neither knew how to cross. One evening, after a particularly long day of official engagements, Charles tried to bridge the gap. "You were wonderful today," he said as they prepared for bed. "The children at the hospital adored you." "They were sweet," Camilla replied, her tone neutral. "Camilla, we need to talk about Dewey." "I thought everything had been said." Charles sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking very old and very tired. "I did what I had to do. Can you not understand that?" "I understand perfectly. You chose the crown over me, as you always would." "As I always knew you would. That is not fair." "Perhaps not, but it is true." She finished her nighttime routine in silence and climbed into bed, turning away from him. After a moment, he did the same. They lay there in the dark. Two people bound by marriage and duty, but separated by something neither could name. Meanwhile, the jewels themselves had been returned to the royal collection. Most were placed back in storage, catalogued and secured. But a few pieces, the most significant ones, were put on special display at the Tower of London. The exhibition was titled, "The Queen's Private Collection, Intimate Treasures of Elizabeth II." It became one of the most popular attractions, drawing thousands of visitors weekly. People stood in front of glass cases, staring at the emerald bracelet, the diamond necklace, the lover's eye pendant. They read the plaques explaining each piece's history. But what they did not read was the full story of how these items had been recovered. That remained tactfully vague. Among the visitors one day was a young woman named Sarah, graduate student studying royal history. She stood in front of the lover's eye pendant for a long time, reading the description over and over. Something about the official narrative did not sit right with her. The timing, the circumstances, the vague language about returning items to the Crown estate. Sarah was writing her thesis on royal property disputes. She had access to archives, 2 old records, 2 documents that most people never saw. She began to dig. What she found was not evidence of theft, but something more complicated. A pattern of informal gift-giving that stretched back decades. A system where royal women passed jewelry among themselves with minimal documentation. An understanding that had worked for generations until suddenly it did not. Sarah's thesis, when completed, would argue that the Camilla scandal was not about stolen jewels, but about a clash between old customs and new accountability. About what happened when informal family practices collided with institutional demands for transparency, but that was for the future. For now, she was just a student taking notes, unknowingly documenting a piece of history that would be debated for years to come. Back at Rommel House, Camilla walked through rooms that felt emptier now. Not because of missing objects, though the absence of certain jewelry boxes left visible gaps, but because of missing trust, missing certainty. Missing the belief that she truly belonged. She stopped in front of a mirror in her bedroom. The same mirror where she had once admired Elizabeth's emerald bracelet on her wrist, feeling for a moment like she was truly part of something larger than herself. Now, when she looked in the mirror, she saw only herself. No borrowed jewels. No inherited legacy. Just Camilla Parker Bowles, who had married a king but would always be an outsider looking in. Her phone rang. It was Edmund Harrow. "Wanted to check in," he said. "Make sure you are doing all right. I am fine." "You do not sound fine." Camilla sat down on the edge of her bed. "Can I ask you something?" "Professionally, off the record, of course. All your research, all the documentation you reviewed. Do you think I stole those jewels?" There was a long pause. Harrow was not a man who spoke carelessly. "I think the truth is more complicated than theft or innocence. I think you operated within a system that was ambiguous by design. Royal families do not use contracts for personal property because it feels transactional, cold. They use trust and understanding, and that works until suddenly everyone needs a paper trail. So I am guilty of what? Operating on trust? You are guilty of being human in a system that increasingly demands perfect documentation. The tragedy is that what worked for your mother-in-law's generation does not work anymore. The world has changed. Transparency is demanded, and people in your position are caught between 2 eras." After the call ended, Camilla sat in silence. Harrow's words echoed in her mind. Caught between 2 eras. That described her entire life, did it not? Too modern for the old guard who would never accept her? Too tied 2 old scandals for the new generation who wanted a fresh start? Forever in between. Forever slightly wrong. She thought about Diana again. Diana, who had been young and beautiful and tragic. Diana, who had died before the world could tire of her. Diana, who would forever be frozen at her peak, canonized and beloved, while Camilla would grow old in the public eye, make mistakes, face scandals, be picked apart piece by piece until there was nothing left that the public respected, unless she changed the narrative. Unless she found a way to matter on her own terms. The idea came to her slowly. A foundation. Her own foundation, funded with her private wealth, dedicated to causes Elizabeth had cared about, but never quite championed enough. Women's literacy. Domestic abuse survivors. The unsexy, difficult work that did not make headlines but changed lives. If she could not win the public's love, perhaps she could earn their respect. Not as Charles's wife. Not as the woman who wore Elizabeth's jewels. But as herself, it would take years. It would require patience and dedication and the thick skin she had developed over decades of public hatred. But she had time, and she had nothing left to lose. 3 months later, the Camilla Foundation was announced. The response was muted at first. Skeptical. Another PR stunt, critics said. Another attempt to rehabilitate a damaged image, but Camilla did not care about the critics. She worked. She visited women's shelters at midnight when no photographers were present. She funded programs quietly, without press releases. She showed up consistently, even when no one was watching. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Articles began appearing about the Foundation's work. Real work, measurable impact, the kind of thing that could not be faked or spun, and people began to wonder if perhaps they had been wrong about her. Not entirely. Not about everything. But perhaps in some ways, Charles watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Pride in what she was accomplishing, but also something like regret, because he knew that this new Camilla, this independent, self-sufficient woman, needed him less than she ever had. The distance between them did not close. If anything, it widened. They were partners still, but the nature of that partnership had changed fundamentally. On their next anniversary, Charles gave Camilla a gift. A simple bracelet. Modern, tasteful, nothing royal about it. Nothing borrowed or inherited. "I thought you might like something that is just yours," he said awkwardly. No history. No complications. Camilla looked at the bracelet and then at her husband. For a moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with decades ago. Imperfect, conflicted, trying.
"Thank you,"
she said. And she meant it. They were not what they had been. The scandal had changed them, individually and together. But perhaps they could become something new. Something that worked in this new reality. Or perhaps not. Only time would tell. But as Camilla fastened the new bracelet around her wrist, she made a silent promise to herself. She would never again mistake borrowed things for her own. She would build her legacy with her own hands, her own work, her own choices. The jewels were gone. The trust was shaken. The fairy tale had ended, but she was still here, still standing, still queen consort. Whatever that meant now, and that would have to be enough. The story ends not with a dramatic conclusion, but with quiet persistence. With the understanding that some wounds heal and some do not. That some scandals destroy people while others forge them into something harder, stranger, more resilient. Camilla had survived. Whether she had truly overcome remained to be seen, but she was done borrowing. Done living on the edges of someone else's history. Whatever came next would be entirely her own.